they're kind of quite gruff about this. They want to do, they don't, you know, in terms of deciding whether or not to do it, really they don't want to show up, they don't want to get shown up, they don't want to be wrong, they don't want to be embarrassed by anything. So sometimes they're kind of like, well, yes, I could do it, of course I could do it, but I don't want to do it. So they're kind of angry about things. So you may have any kind of combination of personality in your child, and what's important to do is to work with it and recognise either whether they need encouraging, whether they need holding back a bit, whether they need to be encouraged to take a risk, whether they just need to be pushed a bit. All sorts of courses. But remember, not everybody shines early, and the story of the tortoise and the hare, it wasn't the one that started out first who got to the line first. So it's an important thing that if your child is up ahead of everybody else, keep them going. If they're not ahead of everybody else, don't worry, just keep pursuing it, and they may well get there. So what can I do as a parent? It's quite interesting. This guy, Benjamin Bloom, did a really interesting big study on about 200 very successful people. And he concluded that there were kind of 3 phases of development. And the first is called the kind of playful phase, which is when children show a natural interest. So my first kind of piece of advice is follow your children's natural interests. So if they show an interest in language, they like playing with words, they like jokes, they like all those kinds of things, then follow that. If they like playing with numbers and looking for number patterns and that kind of thing, follow that. If they like art and playing with colour, follow that. Start with the playfulness. I have a friend whose son grew up to be a concert pianist. And I was asking her, you know, when did you first know that he was musical? And she said, actually, it's rather an embarrassing thing. She said, we used to go along to a little playgroup, and it was in a hall, and there was a piano there, but all the play material was out there, but you weren't allowed to play the piano. But she said, my child, he used to try and play the piano. It didn't matter what else I gave him to play with, he always wanted to crawl back to this piano. And she said in the end, it was, we were asked to leave because he wouldn't leave the piano alone. And she said, and at that point I thought, maybe I should do something about this. And she said it was just like he just loved music from a very, very early age. But then he had to learn how to play, and he had to learn how to play properly, and that's the precision piece. And then finally, you can become original. Because in the end, no one goes to hear a pianist just because they've got grade 8 piano. They go because they bring their own original interpretation. And so the process is playful, precision, originality. And precision is the hardest thing to get with your child, because that's the point where they give up. Playfulness is easy. Originality, if you get to that point, is also not as difficult. It's the precision bit where you have to do your 10,000 hours practice. Of course, some children show really, really very early. They think about things in a quite a sophisticated kind of way. But I'm just going to kind of finish really going through a series of things which I think are just kind of practical things to think about in relation to this, in relation to helping your child. So the first is, right from a very early age, no matter what age your child is, you can begin to develop the kinds of advanced thinking that you want to help them to see. So even with a young baby, you can, as soon as they can talk, you can start suggesting to them it's not just random which order you put these things on. You can come up with a strategy, generate a way forward. So you can ask the child, you know, which one goes first. And they can, in a very early, simple kind of way, begin to generalize. They can begin to tell you it's always the big one that goes first. But they won't tell you that if you don't ask them. So, you know, just asking a simple kind of question is a good way to prompt your child's thinking. Chess. Chess is really good because it makes you plan, makes you think about things. Of course, the novice chess player just thinks one move at a time. So they make a move, then they wait to see what their opponent does, and then depending on what their opponent does, they make a next move. But advanced chess players, they have the whole game in their head. So right from the beginning, they're starting out on a pathway where they're saying to themselves, this is the game I'm going to play. And they will continue to play that particular game, and they've got every move mapped out in their head, and until their opponent makes a move that stops them from playing that game, in which case they just change into another game. So they've got a strategy plan, a big plan. So, you know, playing chess or Connect 4 or any kind of strategy game with your child is just helpful in terms of trying to get them to think beyond the one next step to something more sophisticated. And talk to them. Talking to children, it doesn't matter what age it is the most important thing to do. And it's very difficult to find time in busy lives to do this. So you have to actively sort of seek out time. And it may be in the rhythm of the time in your day, there's special times when that can happen. In my family, with my children, it was often in the car driving to school. We used to drive to school, and it was a good time. I used to insist that they didn't have their iPod on or any other form of distraction, and we would talk. But that was quite good time, because there wasn't a lot of time in the general day otherwise when that kind of happened. So try and carve out a bit of space, whether it's at bedtime, over meal times, when you're travelling somewhere, whenever it is. Just try and make space to just ask and start to talk about anything that your child's interested in. That special time is really important, because the more you discuss and talk with them, the better they will be at putting forward their views and ideas. So it's really important to have this help from home. It really goes a long way. You are very fortunate, those people who have your children here in Regent School in Pattaya. It's a really good school. But whatever the school does, it will never be as much as if you help from home as well. You in partnership, working alongside the school. And I don't mean, you know, giving your children masses and masses of extra sums to do. I just mean this talking, discussing, when they've got their homework, instead of sending them up to their bedroom, just saying to them, you know, tell me what homework you've got, talk to them a little bit about what they're going to do, and then talk to them about when they've done it. As I said, I've got 2 children, and homework was very different with my 2 children. So my daughter is very goal-focused, and she'd come in, she'd say, I've got this to do for homework, I'm going to my bedroom now, I'm going to do it now, I'll be down in an hour. And off she'd go, and I'd say, what is it you're going to be doing? She'd say, no, you don't need to know, I'll tell you in an hour. And then she'd go off, do it, come down, I'd say, how did it go? Yeah, it's fine, don't need to talk about it. And if I said to her, you know, things like, I'd say, oh, well, you've got that to do, and have you thought about reading about that as well? She'd just say, no, they didn't ask for that, we're not doing that, I'm just doing exactly what they told me to do. It's all cut and dried and businesslike. And she's very goal-focused. She did very, very well in school, and went on and did very well in university. She's sort of determines what's needed and gets on and does it. My son, by contrast, would come home from school, and I'd say, what have you got for homework? And he'd start by saying, I've got this thing to do. But they've set it all wrong. And I'd say, what do you mean it's all wrong? And he'd say, well, you know, if they'd only asked us to do this instead of that, it would be so much better. And his sister would say, yeah, but they didn't ask you to do that, did they? So why don't you do what they asked you to do? And but that wasn't enough, you know, he'd be kind of, no, well, and then he'd take ages, it's like, take ages to wind him up to get started. And then he'd get really interested in it, and, you know, and 2 hours later I'd be saying, you know, are you going to have something to eat now? No, I'm doing this now. And he'd just get completely immersed in it. And so he was either not interested or totally immersed. There was no middle way with him. And it took a long time when he was doing exams to get him to understand that you had to answer the requisite number of questions. So if it says 6 questions, you have to do 6 questions. It's no good doing question 1 brilliantly and maybe question 2 and then being halfway through question 3 and running out of time. That does not work. But it wasn't a natural thing for him. If you've got children in the teenage years, you have to be particularly patient. Whatever it is you do, it's not always going to be right. It's sometimes said that that teenagers suddenly find when they become in their 20s that their parents were not as ridiculous as they thought they were when they were 14. Because there's a kind of bit about growing into yourself and having your own personal opinions that makes parenting teenagers sometimes quite difficult. The other thing I wanted to say to you is, if things look different when your child brings their homework home now from how it did when you went to school, don't worry. Some things have changed, but it's really interesting. Just show an interest. This is just a piece of maths that's looking at birth rates in 2 countries in the Middle East. It's not the kind of maths I did at school. It's really good maths, it's really interesting. But don't be fazed by the fact that it's not the same as you experienced. Again here, nice question this, deceptively easy. You can give the answer, but the real clue is, how did you come to that answer? And talking about that is a really interesting thing to do. So these are my top tips to finish with. If you want to nurture high performance in your child, encourage curiosity. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, in his autobiography, he talks about his family, and he says, the thing that they did for me that was most positive was they didn't stop me doing things. And when we went out for walks and that kind of thing, he said my father was just draw my attention to interesting things. Interesting buildings, interesting creatures, anything interesting. And he encouraged my curiosity. Teach them the technique. Try it like this. Think about the footballer. Do it better. You do it better if you do it this way. Help them. Teach them the technical language. Don't be afraid of using the right kind of word. Interesting conversation I once had with a colleague, a teaching colleague of mine, in a small, with some quite young children, very young children. So it was a sort of 6-year-old, and he was showing the teacher his piece of work, and he was showing her a picture of a prehistoric animal, and she was saying to him, he was about 6, and she said, that's very, very interesting. You know how we know about that kind of thing? It's called archaeology. And he looked at her, and he gave her a puzzled look, and then eventually he said, I think you'll find it's called paleontology. And what's kind of interesting there is, someone had not been afraid to use the accurate words, but it helps empower someone because he could then discern between what's archaeology and paleontology from a very young age. Prompting questions, what would happen if? What do you think would happen if? Lots of opportunities for that. Sometimes do that with the cooking. What's going to happen when I do this? Imagination. Don't be afraid to pretend. In my family, my daughter had an imaginary friend for a period of time, and her imaginary friend used to come everywhere with us. And we had to set meals, a place for her at the table. And we had to talk to her. We had to hear about what Jeannie's day at school had been as well as my daughter's. Does it matter? Well, actually, imagination is really important. It helps you create other worlds, and it helps children try out other worlds. And it's a good thing to do. Sometimes as a parent you might feel a little silly getting involved. You shouldn't. Just encourage imagination. As I said before, find a space to talk and ask your child not what did they do at school today, but what did they learn at school today. I've been training some of my colleagues who are not education people in the company in which I work, and one of them was saying to me, I tried that out with my children, asking them that, and I got a very different different answer from the answer I normally get. Because it makes them think and reflect in a different kind of way. Encourage them when things go wrong. Everybody needs their parents when things go wrong. They're the people they still turn to, always. Even in those teenage years when it's a little more difficult for them to ask for help, they still turn to their parents. And don't forget, in your busy lives, where it's simpler just to tell people what to do, remember, listen, listen, listen. Often your children reveal things if you listen carefully enough, but it's all too easy to miss it because you're just in a little bit of a rush. So, finally, keep calm. Don't give up. Remember, it takes 10,000 hours to make an expert. You're trying to help your child become an expert. 10,000 hours of parenting, it's definitely worth it. Just keep at it. So, no magic answers, but also, it's not that difficult. It's common sense, really, and you can do it. And is it worth the effort of supporting your child in that kind of way? I think it probably is, because in going back to what I said right at the beginning, in this kind of really very competitive world, you want to balance having a good school with a good supportive home background too, because together that's what gives your child the chance of the best start in life. Thank you.
I would say I was enjoying that so much. I was sitting there in my seat, clapping away, completely forgetting that I was the host for the evening, expecting somebody to come up on stage, and suddenly realised, that's me. So anyway, I was lost in your talk. It was fascinating, and thank you very much. I know that Professor Eyre is willing to take some questions from the audience if there are some, although we'll have to turn the lights up. But I would also say that on the way out, when we finish, I think you have a little bit of time. So if parents, colleagues, friends want to stop and have a brief chat, of course you can. But also, you should all have a small bit of paper, which we'd love you to fill in. It's feedback, but you can also write if you've got any questions or comments you would like to pass on. All of these will reach me, and I will make sure that if there are any questions that are not answered tonight, that we do our best to do that. So what I'd like to do is to invite any questions really on the theme of what Professor Eyre has been presenting to us this evening. We've got a very bright light there, but I'm hoping that if a few people would like to put their hands up, we'll take a couple of questions and then I'll get out of the way and Professor Eyre can give her thoughts. So, do we have any questions? You're right in the line of the light, so please tell us your question. I'm going to repeat the question for those who might not have heard it. A question about the education system in Finland, where children start somewhat later and are tested somewhat later, and despite this apparent slower start, seem to achieve very highly. Before I pass over to Professor Eyre, is there another question that anybody would like to say now, and then I'll get out of the way. I'm looking for hands. None at the moment. Oh yes, we have one. Okay, so the second question is is there any plans for Professor Eyre to talk to our students? I think I'll get out of the way and let you take those.
Okay, well, a really interesting question about Finland. I think the thing is that the question of, how should an education system develop its children? Personally, I feel strongly that you can go too far on the drilling side. It's definitely the case, you can. And some, Finland's been very successful, but Hong Kong and Singapore have been equally successful, and they do it in exactly the polar opposite way. So in those sort of in the top 10 countries on the PISA data. Singapore and Hong Kong, they have everybody working extremely hard and being tested all the time, and also doing extra work on Saturdays and evenings. And then Finland, by contrast, seem to get to the same level of outcome in a much more relaxed and with less assessment at various different points in the system. So one of the things one has to conclude is there's many ways to get to the optimal outcome. And so sitting behind that is also the second question, which is, so if there's many ways to get to the optimal outcome, which ones are best for our children? And I guess the answer is that assessment is good in as much as it helps people to take the next step, assessment for learning, as opposed to simply being ranked all the time and being told this is where you are. So I think my kind of point is that I think it's interesting how Finland get to where they are. The Finnish education system, of course, does enable children to engage in play from a very early age, and one of the points that I was making is that learning happens in different kinds of ways. So formal sitting down using a pencil is one form, but actually play is a really important part of all of that. And I think that sometimes we do move into formal learning more quickly than might be optimal. That's my personal view, is that and sometimes when we're working in a kind of formal learning environment, we also think that practicing again and again and again in a formal way is the best way to acquire the knowledge, and it's not necessarily. So